Okay, welcome. Today is our Relax into Health, Wealth, and Happiness meeting, and it's nice to have you here. So today I'd like to explore a very simple, uh, very simple topic. I, I laugh a little bit because as soon as I said it's simple, I realize it is simple, but it's also probably because of its simplicity, it's very difficult. But it's a very important, in my estimation, it's a very important, very valuable topic, which is the proper understanding of what we could term the spiritual and the material, to understand their relationship to one another and your relationship to them. So I just use these terms spiritual and material, but we could maybe take a moment to look at what it is that is actually being referred to there. Maybe before I do that, I'll just briefly uh, elaborate why I believe this is so valuable and important, because it's such a fundamental thing, but one that we, in the course of a usual, normal, if there's such a thing, average lifetime, does not is not looked at seriously, and so we are operating under assumptions, and it turns out that that's unhelpful. And because it's such a fundamental thing, I mean, if you consider, really, to have an understanding, what I'm talking about is to have an understanding of the spiritual, the material, and you, and how they all relate. I don't know how it could get too much more fundamental than that. I mean, like, who are you? What is reality? What is its nature? How does it work? And what's your relationship to all of it? Seems pretty fundamental. If we don't have that understanding, or if we have not at least seriously engaged with this inquiry, then we really should expect that we're going to do badly, I would think. Because what are the chances that you're going to succeed if you don't have even the most fundamental understanding of what's even going on? But of course, that's how most of us are operating, but in total ignorance, right? And that's just the status quo. So, um, conversely, having that knowledge, or having at least a sincere inquiry into this matter, allows for a person to begin to live more successfully, or at least uh, live less unsuccessfully, which I suppose is sort of the same thing. But to say living less unsuccessfully paints it in maybe a more modest way, right? So if we can look and see what, which most people will never do, but we could pause for just a moment, just an instant, and actually observe and notice how, what an enormous amount of energy and time is consumed by what we could term mistakes, repeated mistakes in life. You know, how many times have you attempted to deal with the situation in your life recurrently with using the same reaction unsuccessfully, like frustration, depression, anger, fear, jealousy, envy, regret, guilt, shame, blame. These are the kinds of strategies that we resort to probably dozens of times a day, if not more. And every time we do, it's produces the same undesirable result. So we resort to these same unsuccessful strategies, wasting huge amounts of time and energy. And I'm proposing that that is because we really have no clue about what's really going on at all. I mean, just zero awareness. And so we can expect that by actually beginning to examine sincerely what it is that's actually going on, who I am, what this is, and what the relationship of all this is, at a very fundamental level, things should begin to shift in a positive way, because at the very least, which is pretty big actually, we will have the ability to stop making the same mistake over and over and over and over and over. Probably won't happen just like that. I think I'm better at snapping with that hand than this. I'm not great at it with either, but yeah, better with my left hand. That's why I always do it with my left hand. But it's probably not going to happen like that. It probably is going to happen a little bit more slowly. But if we understand how foundational this is, then we'll continue to look at it and then continue to benefit from it. So that's the background of why I believe that this will be useful for us to look at. I think it will be very profitable in our lives, but I'm also suggesting that we have to have, we don't have to, we'll probably benefit further if we have somewhat modest expectations. I mean, the expectation should be, on the one hand, great, because this is so foundational that this can radically shift our experience of ourselves and our life. But the modest part is that it's probably not going to happen in an instant. It's probably going to happen over a series of instances that we have to continue to make this shift by continuing to look in this way. But when we do, then we can have the great expectation that things over a more broad amount of time will shift in very substantial ways. Okay, so that hopefully I've provided, I've sold you a little bit on the benefit. Okay, enough that maybe you'll stick it out. So now back to back to the topic at hand, which is to understand the spiritual, the material, and your relationship to them and their relationship to one another. So we need to, these terms, spiritual and material, we probably should get a little clearer on, because if we just throw those terms around, then there's too much room for interpretation, and they're kind of loaded terms already. So let's see if we can maybe get a little clearer on them collectively so that we can all be communicating possibly. So, okay, so material, we could say, would be, another term we could use somewhat interchangeably would be objective. So we have an objective experience or an objective reality, an objective world, and we could say it's material world. So objects, material. So it's that which most of us are largely focused on most of the time. So we take ourselves to be an object, right? Who am I? Well, I'm this person. Well, who is the person? Well, this body, and everything that goes along with this body. So this is my body and my clothing and my house and my car and all of my stuff. Okay, so all of that would be the material or objective. So at that level, we give a lot of attention to, well, if we think about what are the kind of three broad categories of things that we're concerned with in life. We could say at an objective level, it would be our health, our call it wealth, and our relationships. Okay, kind of broad categories that cover most of what it is that we're interested in at a material level. So materially, we associate health with the physical body. So, and because it's a very materialistically focused culture, broadly speaking, then even everything else within the cultural context is tied in with the physical. So even if we talk about mental health, of course, that's usually viewed as broadly in the culture. It's now suggested that our mental health is actually a physical, material thing because it's, neurotransmitters and these kinds of things. So it's all has a physical basis, objective basis. Our wealth we conceive of as how much stuff we have and how much ability to have things we have, right? So how much, even though money is a rather abstract notion, but it's still very material in the sense that it's really just our notion about it is how we can acquire things. And then our relationships are also usually very material, have a material focus. It's like how we could say by extension that actions are also material because they're demonstrated, so we can actually perceive them as something that has some kind of physicality to it. There's an action that occurs. And so most of our relationships are fairly transactional in a general sense. If you're just you're like most people, influenced by the culture with a relatively low level of conscious awareness, then that's all that's available. You're just interested in relationship wise, what are these other people doing and what do they have and how is that going to affect me and how I feel and what I have. Okay, so that's the material. And then the spiritual would be in some sense would be anything that's not that. That's a little bit, as we'll see, that's not quite right, but we could just in contrast, we could to see what is spiritual. We could say spiritual is, at least as a starting point for our conversation, and we'll expand this momentarily, but at least as a starting point, we could say, well, let's look at it in contrast to the material. So the spiritual, because a lot of the time we might think the spiritual is just you have to believe in it. You have to believe in spirit. It doesn't, otherwise it's just doesn't have any reality apart from that. But the thing is, do you have to believe in yourself, not as a person, not as a body, but you have to believe that you exist? Oh, it's obvious, right? You know that you exist, but your existence is not material fundamentally. I mean, at least not subjectively. It's not material. Your existence, you can't find it. This is the big challenge in consciousness studies: is they're so certain that consciousness is a physical, it's a manifestation of some sort of physical material thing. So they're looking for it. Where is this consciousness? It exists somewhere in there. They're looking in the brain usually. They're like, so it exists in there somewhere as some kind of thing. But they can't find it. They haven't been able to find it. Well, if we were just stop for a moment and observe our actual experience, it would be no surprise that we couldn't find it, because of course we can't find it. You can't find your existence. It's not a material thing. It's immaterial. And despite the fact that there's this attempt to assign all of the other immaterial aspects of experience to material cause, like saying that your emotions are caused by neurotransmitters, which are physical things, something which has never been proven. The actual experience is that our feelings are immaterial. Our our emotions are immaterial. Our thoughts are immaterial. We don't see them. We don't feel them. We're not able to. I mean, we don't feel them as sense them as objects that we can grasp, for example. So they're immaterial. So it turns out that actually, if we start to look in a subjective sense instead of through the lens of our inculcated objectivity, then we can start to notice, oh, it's perfectly clear that the vast majority of my experience is in fact non-material. And that's what I'm calling the spiritual. So this, I'm saying spiritual would be that which is non-material, or we could say that which is subjective. So the material is objective and the spiritual is subjective. These are the terms that I'm using. This is the definitions that I'm using for this context. Other people in different contexts may use different definitions, but that's how I'm defining it. So, okay, so hopefully that's somewhat clear. We've got material or objective, and we've got spiritual or subjective. Now, that's, as I've hinted at, that's somewhat misleading, because it presents it as though there is a fundamental opposition, like there's the objective and the subjective and they're separate, or there's the material and the spiritual and they're separate. But let's look a little bit more closely now. Have my prop, which you know probably, and so conventionally we would say that this jar is an object, so it's a material. Fine, as far as it goes, it's yes, by the definition that we're using, this is objective, it's a material. But now we want to look a little bit more closely, because we want to start to examine what's the relationship between the spiritual and the material. And again, the purpose of this exploration is to start to have a more understanding and direct experience as it relates to the nature of spiritual and material and the self and the relationship between them, because it's so fundamental. And with this knowledge and understanding, we can stop making the same mistakes over and over, and we can begin to live more successfully, which will allow us to relax into health, wealth, and happiness. Okay. So I'm just saying that because otherwise it seems like kind of abstract, and what's the point? But I want to be clear. It's very practical, has practical value. So yes, this is an object. No, I'm not going to say that it's not, because otherwise the whole idea of objective reality becomes useless. So yes, as far as it goes, this is an object. But now the question is, what we're wanting to understand, what's the relationship between the objective and the material and the spiritual, or the objective and the subjective? So how do I know about this object? Now, you already have heard this, so you might want to rush ahead and think, oh, I already know this. But let's just look at it in a fresh way. Even if we say the same things, let's at least look at it in a fresh way. Just pretend like you don't know. Um, and just approach it in a fresh way. So how do I know this? How do you know? And you could do this with, maybe it would be helpful if you happen to have some kind of thing that you could, some kind of object that you could do this with for yourself. If nothing else, you could do it with your own body. Maybe you're sitting on something that would do, the chair or whatever. Any object that you might have that you can actually do this exploration with, it might be helpful so that it's actually more real for you rather than just being a demonstration on a screen. So how do I know this? So you ask yourself, how do I know that this object is in fact an object? By what means do I know this? So if we try and sort of tease that apart, we would have to say, just kind of going about this in the best way that we can, we might start to say, well, I have a thought, right? So I have a thought that tells me that this is an object, right? So in this case, it says, I have a thought that says this is a jar. So that's one of the ways in which I know that this is an object, is the thought. Now, if I just have the thought that this is a jar, and that was all that I had, so let's say now I say, this is a jar. It's not as convincing because all I have is the thought, but there's nothing else to substantiate that. So bring back my prop, and then I say, this, I have the thought, this is a jar, and now it's combined with some other things, which makes it seem more real and substantial. So what are the other things? Well, I can see it. So there's a visual, there's an image. Okay, so I have a thought and an image. I can feel it. So there's a sensation of touch. And I'm tapping on it, so there's sound. It would probably be less convincing if I was tapping on it and there was no sound. Then I would think, what is this? What is going on? That's very strange. It would be, it would detract from my sense of there being a material reality here, right? I might start to think, oh, I'm hallucinating. So there has to be this substantiation by these, by the thought and the various sensory data joining together in cohering in a way that matches with my expectation. I mean, similarly, even if I tapped on it and there was a meowing sound, that there would be a sound, but it wouldn't match with my expectation. So that would also similarly create some kind of strange effect that would create a kind of incoherence. So there has to be a coherence of the thought, and that thought has with it a whole packaged up all of these experiences which create an expectation, right? And because I've done this before, not, obviously I've done it before in the meetings on the screen, but I mean, in my life, I've had these experiences in which I've interacted with this kind of phenomenon. And so all of those past experiences are packaged up along with the thought, so that when I have the thought, all of those experiences that are packaged up are also there, that allow me to access the expectation of what should happen. And then the question is there a match? So far, so good. There's a match. So now I'm convinced, yeah, there's an object here. It's a jar. All is well. It makes sense to me. I know what it is. Okay, so that might seem like, again, abstract, and what is the value of that? But here's the point: is what is the if we explore what the evidence is of the objective, it turns out that it's all subjective phenomena, right? So the way that I know about the object is that I have a thought. Well, that thought is what is the thought? Well, it's in the domain of the spiritual or the subjective, right? It's immaterial. I have this expectation based on past experiences, memory. Well, again, it's a spiritual or immaterial or subjective phenomenon. And then all this sensory stuff, which is also a subjective experience. It's not objective, it's completely subjective. The in the I think it would be classified as, I think this would be classified as Sankhya philosophy, which is like yogic philosophy of India. The senses are there's 10 senses. There's 5 outer and 5 inner, and they obviously correspond, right? So there's the outer, let's say, sight, and then there's the inner sight, the outer taste, the inner taste. So they connect. You have to have the outer and the inner have to match up. If you have the outer without the inner, then there's not a complete experience. So I think the point here is that we can actually have the inner experience without having to have the outer experience. So you couldn't really have the outer experience without the inner experience, I don't think. I don't know how that would work. But you could have the inner experience without the outer. In other words, you could imagine something, you could daydream about something, or you could dream at night about something. So you have this entirely subjective sensory experience that has no so-called objective component to it. And the point I'm making here, albeit probably not that well, is that the inner senses are the most fundamental. Without those, you can't. That there's no experience to be had. You have to be able to have the inner experience. So the fundamental sensory experience is all subjective. So now the broader point I'm making is that in order to know this object, all I have is subjective phenomena. Okay, so then the question is, remember, we're looking at what's the relationship between the inner and the outer, or the subjective and the objective, or the spiritual and the material. And at first, it was defining them in a potentially useful and conventional sense, that the objective is this outer material thing, and then the spiritual is the immaterial, subjective inner experience. But when we actually look at it more closely, because the idea here is that we're looking to see what's the relationship between these two, turns out that the relationship appears to be that the objective, or the material, is known only through subjective phenomena, which maybe you understand how that's useful and maybe you don't. So we'll look at it because I'm proposing it's very useful and important. So let's look at that a little bit more closely. So if my outer experience, if my objective experience, if the material is only accessible or known through a subjective experience, hopefully that makes sense to you, that you can see how that's true. But really, I'm proposing all of this for you to be able to look at it um, and look at it for yourself. And maybe that seems, hopefully it's a challenging idea. It certainly radically challenges the status quo, because the status quo holds that the material is the only reality, and that the spiritual is just like a byproduct of the material, and it's not particularly useful. But if we actually follow what's being proposed here, then and really see this clearly for ourselves, then it turns out that this normal way of perceiving things doesn't actually make any sense at all. Because if the objective reality, or the material reality, which is commonly held to be the only true reality, is only accessible through the subjective or spiritual, then how on earth do we know that it's that we've got it right, if we think that the material is the fundamental reality? And by what means would we know that? And certainly, how could we so neatly dismiss the spiritual as insignificant or trivial, or just a mere byproduct of the material, when the only way we know about the material is through the spiritual? So our very means of access is spiritual, but then in this sleight of hand, the spiritual is dismissed. So this is, in my view, it's very, very significant. So, and the implications of this are very far-reaching. So see how it is that, well, okay, so far, again, I'm proposing that these are things that you can look at and question and inquire into for yourself, not just a one-time thing, but ongoing, to really start to shift how you're seeing yourself and your life, so that you can possibly help yourself to stop making the same basic painful mistakes and start to open to new, fresh, life-affirming possibilities. Okay. So it's something, just don't just take it as a belief, but question it and look at it in your life, and just see, as you're going throughout your days, observe all of the material, all of the objective, and just notice, is there anything there that you can actually say for sure that you have access to, independent of, or not mediated by, the subjective or spiritual? And then notice that very likely, I can't say for sure, but it's very likely, extraordinarily likely, that your habit is to flip them around, and to put the material or objective as the first priority, to take that as the primary reality, the fundamental reality, and to sort of dismiss or trivialize the spiritual, or to see it as a byproduct, or something that's not, at least not very powerful, or not, it's just not high priority. Because most of the time we've been inculcated into this way of perceiving that the material is the only reality, and it's insidious. If you just really start to observe, I think you'll see that this is true, and that as I say, it's insidious. It has reached into every corner of your life. So by looking at it sincerely, repeatedly, over and over and over, and questioning, then you start to shift this within yourself. Now, the next thing would be to see, what are the what's the result of that habitual way of perceiving? In other words, what do you how is it that you well, using the same kind of phrasing I was using earlier, what are the same basic mistakes that you make over and over and over and over? So you can just start to look and see, might it be, ask yourself this question, might it be that the frustration or fear or guilt or shame or blame, victimization, regret, anger, etc., whatever those things are for you, that I experience regularly, might that be a result of of perceiving things in a fundamentally incorrect way? And specifically, might it be the result of perceiving and believing that the material is the fundamental reality, and thereby attempting to do all of the work in my life at that level, or at least making that the highest priority? So it's sort of like, well, another way to find out, kind of be truthful with yourself about this would be this: in moments of crisis, where because this will reveal to you, in crisis will reveal to you your real your actual beliefs. Okay, so when in moments of crisis, what do you prioritize, the material or the spiritual? Are you strategizing in moments of crisis for how to protect physically, materially, to get more money or bolster your health, or to organize and your relationships in such a way that you can feel that at a material objective level you're doing something to get it sorted out? Or do you prioritize your subjective experience and start to take an honest inventory of your beliefs and the thoughts that you're having and the way that you construct your reality subjectively and project that as a material reality? In other words, if I'm troubled by this jar, I'm not, but if I was troubled by the jar, and I'm experiencing a crisis with the jar, am I just trying to do away with the jar? Is that my focus, is just trying to get this object away or smash it or something? Or in that moment of crisis, am I actually willing to look at my subjective experience and all of the components of that and see how it is that the crisis is being constructed in my own consciousness, knowing that the objective is, or at least believing, accepting that I've examined and seen enough to convince myself that it must be true that this, like all other objective experiences that I've had, must be a subjective construct. then rather than giving my power away again, I would have to admit that it would be more likely to produce a more desirable outcome if I was to actually see how it is that I'm creating the crisis, because the crisis exists subjectively. And so I want to actually, if I want real change, I have to look to see how is it that this is constructed. And as I've pointed out many times before, this is to actually claim one's own power. If I don't, if I'm behaving exclusively at a material level, or pretending that the material is the primary reality, then really I'm giving away all my power. But to focus on the spiritual or subjective is to reclaim that power. And it occurs to me that we could see it that in this way, that the objective or the material level of experience or existence is the densest level. So the energy has become as condensed as it's going to become. And because of that, it takes an enormous amount of energy to produce change relative to subtler levels or spiritual levels of existence. So that sounds maybe abstract, but think about it. If I want to move this jar, then at a physical level, then I actually have to exert the energy. I have to reach over and pick it up to move it. This is a very simple example, but we'll just start here. So if I have to use energy to do that. Now, what's easier, moving it physically or just imagining that it's moved? Clearly it's easier to imagine it. And this becomes clearer if we think about, okay, what is it easier assuming you don't live in China presently, is it easier to travel to China physically, in the physical dimension, or in your imagination? Clearly, it's much easier to travel to China in your imagination because you can do it like that. The instant that the idea is proposed, it's already happened. In order to even entertain the idea, even consider it, it's already been done. You've already done it. You've already traveled there, because you have to do that in your imagination to be able to compare it. So in our imagination, which is a we'd say non-material, spiritual, subjective level of our existence, everything is much easier and also much faster. So, how long would it take physically to travel to China? Well, a while. I don't know. It's probably, obviously it depends where you live. From where I live, it would take quite a long time, much longer than I'm interested in. So I'm probably not going to China anytime soon. But in my imagination, it takes no time at all. It's already done. Now, this might seem like not an interesting, useful observation, but it is very useful, because the point I'm making is that the amount of energy and time involved in working at the material level is enormous when compared to that of the spiritual. So the spiritual level, you're actually beyond time. So time is not a factor. And actually, I would say, depending on what level we could say there's different levels of spiritual reality, but many levels of spiritual reality, you're actually transcendent of time of energy entirely. Um, and and in any case, all of them are less dense than the material level. So the material level is the most dense, requires the most energy input to produce change. So it's inefficient to work at that level. And no big surprise then that we don't learn very well at that level and therefore keep making the same mistakes, because there doesn't really seem to be any sense of there's no space or time for us to learn sufficiently in order to overcome those errors in our understanding. So we just keep going back to the same ineffective reactions to things. Okay, so if we are willing to trust that, well, I mean, trust through actually having looked at it and looking at it repeatedly and convincing ourselves that it sure does seem to be the case that the objective is in fact the dense result of the subjective. So we could view it as like there's a continuation, so that really the material is not separate from the spiritual. The material is just the end result of the spiritual. It's the densest version of the spiritual. And so if we want to produce or affect some kind of change, or to really take any action at the material level, it's much more profitable to shift our attention to the spiritual and start to see, how is it that I have constructed this physical experience, this material experience, and then reconstruct it according to what is desired. So, like I said, it's a very simple idea. And as usual, I've elaborated on it in maybe ad nauseum. But but I really honestly believe that this is probably one of the top, it's definitely in the top 10 most important things. It may be in the top 3, or in terms of living a successful life. Because like I said from the beginning, if I don't have an understanding, if I have the wrong understanding or an inefficient understanding of how reality is constructed and what my relationship to that is, then the chances are very good that I'm going to make the same kinds of mistakes over and over and over, and my learning will be very, very slow, and that will result in a lot of unpleasantness. So even though this is such a simple thing, if a person takes it to heart and really applies this knowledge and inquires repeatedly to see the truth of it for themselves, then it, as I also said from the beginning, it can produce radical change in the person's life, because when you work at a more fundamental level, you have much more leverage to affect change. So to state all of this in a same basic thing, but try to state it in a slightly different way, we could see that every material outcome is the result of immaterial causes. So everything that happens starts with some kind of idea, if we use that word in a loose sense to mean maybe some kind of there has to be some kind, well, yeah, there has to be an idea, there has to be some sense of why an action is being taken. So the action follows the idea. And so every outcome is a result of an idea. Well, the idea is immaterial or spiritual. So the causes of all the material results are spiritual. They're subtle in comparison, so they have less density to them. So we can make changes to at the spiritual level much more rapidly and relatively easily. So then I think a hang up or a problem that can come, at least that I've observed in my own experience, is that there's this time factor. So it seems like, and I don't know, strictly speaking, time does not have to be a factor, but it seems that it is a factor. And I'm still exploring why this is, because I've seen that it's not always a factor. And I've seen that there are some people, very small minority, but some people who are able to sidestep time as a factor, in meaning that they can produce miraculous, what we would consider to be miraculous changes at the material level instantly, or at least it appears to be instant. But so I'm still exploring that to see how that is, how one can achieve that, what the knowledge is and experience is necessary for that. But in the meantime, for the rest of us, while we still seem to have time as a factor in this whole process, then I think it's also useful to have some skillful understanding in regard to time, to be able to work with all this knowledge in a practical way. Because if all of this, you can see the truth of this, or you can at least see some of the truth of it, then what might happen is you might say, okay, I got it. I can see that all of that my attention has been fixated on the material level. I'm just trying to get my stuff ironed out at a material level. That's all I've been focused on. And it's a real drag, and it's really hard and painful and frustrating. And I do continue to make the same mistakes over and over, and get the same results. I seem to, no matter how hard I work, no matter what I try to do, I keep making the same mistakes of applying frustration, anger, disappointment, discouragement, depression, fear, anxiety, etc. And no big surprise, I keep getting more of the same. So hopefully you can see all of that, and then you can see, yeah, does seem to be true that all material results are caused by or the results of spiritual or immaterial causes, ideas, and that it makes sense that if we work at that level, at the subtler levels, we can begin to reorganize and reconstruct our experience and our reality, so that as that shift occurs, then a different material outcome is the result. Hopefully that makes sense. It's not even all that esoteric, actually. It's just sort of common sense when you finally slow down and acknowledge it, that if you want change in your life, you have to be willing to see what are the causes rather than the effects, right? Another completely simple way of putting it is that there's a cause to every effect. And if you're working at the level of effect, then you can't reasonably expect to get good results. But if you work at the level of the cause, then you're much more likely to get a good outcome. So hopefully that you can you can see that makes sense. Yes, there's got to be causes to these effects in my life. And if I want to change the effects, I need to work at the level of cause. Well, then the level of cause is, as I've been proposing here, it's subjective. So it's what are the attitudes, what are the beliefs, what are the images, what are the memories, how do I assemble all of this sensory data and combine that with these beliefs and memories and so forth in order to construct this outcome, to justify these particular ineffective, painful, repeated mistakes that I make that continue to reinforce the same things that I don't want. So if we look at that, then we can start to see, oh, I actually can begin to reconstruct that. I can reconfigure things. I actually have that power. I can begin to question my beliefs. I can begin to deconstruct things. So practically speaking, we want to just start to see, okay, I've been believing certain things. And I've been organizing all of my subjective experience to confirm that this is so. So, this jar is not a big problem for me, but if it was, then I would really want to start to see, how is it that I'm constructing this? Well, there's a belief the jar is a problem to me. Okay. And what is it? What are the things that go along with that? Well, I remember the time yesterday when the jar was a problem for me, and the day before that when the jar was a problem for me, and the day before that. And okay, well, what were the things? What's the evidence that it was a problem? Well, I was feeling bad. I was feeling angry, and I was in pain, and whatever. So all of these things are being combined in my consciousness to construct this outcome. Well, I want to start to see that no matter what I've tried to do in order to solve this problem at the material level, I keep having the same problem. So I need to now look at the spiritual level and start to see what are the components and start to deconstruct it, and then see that I have the ability to shift it, to start to reconstruct my reality, including my material reality, but by focusing on the spiritual. So just to start to see that these things that I'm holding to be true are not actually fundamentally true. They're not fundamental truths. They're just relative truths, things that where I've just planted a flag and I said, this is the truth, and I'm going to organize everything around this. But when I take a step back, I can question that and I can see, well, I'm in pain. I don't like that. I'm not happy with the way I've constructed things. So let me start to deconstruct it. Just see what are the different parts and pieces of this. And as I tease them apart, I can start to see, oh, it's not fundamentally true. I just planted a flag there. And since I don't like it, I can begin to shift it. Now, again, back to the time factor, because what will normally happen, at least in my experience, is that there's usually a lot of parts and pieces to the way that I've constructed the thing, the outcome that I'm not happy with. And they're not all going to become usually clear to me in a flash. And plus, I might have some kind of attachments to some of them. And it usually takes some time to uncover all of the parts and pieces and to release the unhealthy attachments to them. Just like, see if I can make this clear with an example. So okay, let's say I have a conflict with a neighbor, and so this is the situation, the outcome that I'm not happy about, and I've tried all the various ways to sort it out at the material level, and it hasn't worked. I tried talking with the neighbor, and that didn't work, and I tried calling the police, and that didn't work, and I tried a lawyer, and that didn't work, and I tried smashing his windows, and that didn't work. I tried all these different things, and none of it's working. So now I see, okay, there's something about this that is really, I've got to do this differently. So I start to deconstruct it and I see, okay, this belief that my neighbor is a problem for me is really not serving me well. It's not giving me good results. And so, but that's where I've planted my flag. My neighbor is a problem. And so I start to see, okay, I've got all of this stuff that's associated with that, that's organized around that idea, all of these different memories of things that I believe that my neighbor did. And um, so there's a lot of content there, especially if it's a long relationship, right? You know, if I've lived next to this person for 20 years, then a lot of material there to work through. And plus, it's probably goes, it's not even just about the neighbor at all. I mean, if it's not about the neighbor, so there's other stuff that's not even directly connected with the neighbor that starts to come out. You know, it's like stuff with my parents and stuff with my teachers and whatever. So these things come out of the woodwork when I start to tease it apart and deconstruct it. That then there's going to be some attachments that are also here. So there's time that seems to often be required just to do the deconstruction because of all the bits and pieces that have to come out of the woodworks. And then there will be unnecessary and painful attachments to some of these things before they can, that will necessitate that they get worked through as well, because it may be, I mean, there's so many ways that the attachments could take place, but you know, they might be I can't really, it would I'd go on for another hour if I tried to detail all the different ways in which those attachments could take place. But um, maybe that's enough for today. You could just start to see that that's the case. So what I'm encouraging is that you are patient with the process, because it's going to take as much time as it's going to take for you. But if you see that it will definitely take more, that will take more time if you don't sincerely apply yourself to it. And it will take less time if you do sincerely apply yourself to it. So maybe it's going to take 1,000 years if you apply yourself sincerely and you say, oh my goodness, that's too long, I don't have that much time. But then you say, well, yeah, but it will take 1,000,000 years if you don't apply yourself sincerely. So in that way, you can see it's better to apply yourself sincerely, even though it's going to take 1,000 years. It probably won't take 1,000 years, but just my point is that it's always, in my estimation, it's always better to apply myself sincerely to this inquiry, regardless of how much time how much time is going to be required. You know, it's going to take however long it's going to take, but thing that the only choice I have in the matter is I can either make it longer and more painful by trying to find some other way around this, or I can make it as minimally painful and as short as possible by applying myself sincerely and not concerning myself with how long it's going to take or how uncomfortable it might be. Because, yeah, it might be really uncomfortable if I'm accustomed to focusing on the material, and then I say, well, that's not working, I'm going to focus on the spiritual, because then I might start to perceive that I'm vulnerable. You know, before I was doing all these things at this outward material level, and that gave me a false sense of protecting myself. You know, when I'm smashing my neighbor's windows, I feel like I'm taking some action that's helping me. And if instead of taking that kind of action, I'm going to instead, my neighbor is going to be doing all the things that he does, but instead of me having this false sense that I'm protecting myself by taking these actions, I'm going to instead just be looking at my subjective experience and noticing all of the ways in which I've constructed it that leaves me maybe feeling quite vulnerable. And so that might be uncomfortable. But that in my experience, that discomfort has to be met and worked through, because that's a big obstacle to um, allowing myself to actually give myself fully to the spiritual aspect of my experience, which is what's going to give me the good results. So it's like a gateway that has to be passed through. I feel uncomfortable. I feel afraid. Okay, but I have to pass through that gateway in order to shift my attention consistently and adequately to where I have the ability to actually produce the real change that I want and need in my life. And so I have to be willing to do that. And so, yet again, uh, taking this today just slightly over an hour, exploring a very simple subject in great detail. But I hope that you have found this to be useful, and I hope that you will um, take this and look at it for yourself and take it to heart and really sincerely begin to apply it. Question, just look. Yeah, maybe you don't have to apply it to everything in your life, because maybe that's, I mean, today you don't have to apply it to everything in your life today, because that's maybe a lot to ask. But you could maybe just find one thing, like one painful thing in your life, where you have been trying to fix this at a material level. You've been trying to do, all of the right things. You've followed the advice of the experts. You've invested wisely according to the advice, and you're doing the right exercises, and you're eating in the right way, and you're saying all the right things, and you're following the right techniques, and all of these things. And you're still running up against the same fundamental problem. Then I'm just encouraging you to look at this one thing, be willing to take this one thing and begin to apply what has been shared today in a sincere and consistent manner, and see that actually it really will work. It will give you tremendous peace. Again, probably not instantly. In fact, like I said, there's immediately more likely to be more discomfort. But when you apply it persistently and consistently and sincerely, I'm saying, I know that it will provide you with tremendous peace, and um, and that it will help you to reclaim your authentic power, so that if you so choose, you can actually begin to reshape your entire experience and your world, at least around this one thing, even down to the material level, when you apply it consistently. So I hope that makes enough sense that you can make use of it. And if you have questions about it, I'm happy to stay on for Q&A, but I'm going to end this recording now.